He leaned in. He said 7 words. She did not hear the music after that. 300 people in a ballroom, and the only sound in her head for the rest of the night was a sentence spoken so quietly that nobody else could have heard it, delivered by a man she had never met, in a voice that carried no intention except honesty, and she spent the next 4 hours trying to remember how to breathe normally and failing every single time. I am not going to tell you what he said yet. You will hear it when she does. For the second time, in a moment neither of them planned. Before we get there, tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight so I can see how far this story travels. And if you have ever heard a single sentence that rewired the way you saw yourself, hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. That morning, in a small row house in southeast Washington, Noel Adeyemi was braiding his daughter's hair while she held a mirror and delivered corrections with the authority of a quality control inspector. Dad, the left side is thicker. It is not thicker. Hold the mirror. Look, that one has more hair. He looked. She was right. She was always right about hair, the way she was always right about colors and symmetry and which shelf in the grocery store had the better cereal, and he had learned sometime in the last 3 years that arguing with a 7-year-old who had inherited her mother's eye for detail was a losing proposition dressed up as a morning routine. Sade Adeyemi had her father's patience and her mother Amara's precision, which was a combination that made her, at 7, the most quietly formidable person he knew. Amara had been a weaver. Not a hobby weaver, a trained textile artist who could look at a bolt of fabric and see the entire pattern before the first thread was placed. She had died when Sade was 4, and Noel still found threads in unexpected places sometimes, caught in a drawer joint or wound around a curtain rod, faint copper-colored threads that Amara had used for everything, and every time he found one he paused and held it a moment before putting it away. He carried one in his wallet. Not as a keepsake exactly, more as a coordinate, a way of knowing where he was in relation to where he had been. Tonight was the Blackwell Foundation's Winter Gala, the largest charity event in the district, and Noel was not a guest. He was the facilities coordinator for the Meridian Hotel, where the gala was being held, which meant he would spend the evening making sure 300 wealthy people never once had to think about the lights, the sound, the temperature, or the 100 invisible systems that made their evening feel effortless. He was good at being invisible. He had spent his whole career getting good at it. The problem was that tonight, for approximately 7 seconds, he would become the most visible person in a room full of people who had spent their lives being seen, and he would not understand what he had done until it was far too late to take it back. He finished the braid. Sade approved it with a nod that suggested she was being generous. He dropped her at Miss Tanya's, the woman across the street who had been watching Sade on event nights since Amara passed, and drove to the hotel with the copper thread in his wallet and no idea that he was driving toward the most important sentence of his life. The Meridian Hotel ballroom at 8 on a December evening is a machine designed to make important people feel more important. Crystal, candlelight, the specific golden warmth that only comes from lighting budgets that exceed most people's annual salary. 300 guests. Black tie. A string quartet playing something classical that nobody was listening to because the real music at events like this was the sound of money talking to money. Thea Blackwell stood near the center of the room in a black dress that her stylist had chosen because it said power without saying effort, and she was performing the version of herself that 300 people expected to see. 37 years old, chief executive of the Blackwell Foundation, one of the largest charitable organizations on the East Coast. She smiled when she was supposed to smile. She laughed when conversations required laughter. She held eye contact at the precise duration that communicated warmth without vulnerability. A skill she had perfected across a decade of rooms exactly like this one. Nobody in that room knew she was exhausted. Not physically. The kind of exhaustion that comes from years of being admired by everyone and known by no one. From being the most powerful person in every room and the loneliest person in most of them. She had ended her last relationship 8 months ago, a man who had loved her resume more than her face. And since then she had filled the space with work and galas and the particular busyness that allows a person to avoid the question of whether any of it actually matters. Adrian Cross, her vice president, had been orbiting her all evening with the practiced persistence of a man who confused proximity with chemistry. He brought her drinks she did not ask for. He touched the small of her back when he introduced her to donors. He said, "You look incredible tonight," in a voice that expected something in return for the compliment. Noel was not supposed to be on the ballroom floor. He was supposed to be in the service corridor, managing the lighting board for the keynote presentation that was scheduled for 9:15. But a microphone stand had come loose from its base near the stage, and nobody else was available, and the floor manager had sent him out with a wrench and instructions to fix it quickly and disappear. He was kneeling beside the stand, tightening the bolt, when he noticed the woman 10 feet away. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. Because of her eyes. He had spent his whole working life in rooms full of people performing, and he had developed, somewhere along the way, the ability to see through the performance to the thing underneath, the way a mechanic sees through the sound of an engine to the failing part. Her eyes were smiling. Her eyes were also the saddest thing in the room. He finished the repair. He stood. He should have walked back to the service corridor. That was the job. That was the boundary. Instead, he did something he would spend weeks trying to explain to himself, and never quite managing. He walked toward her. Not aggressively, not with the confidence of a man who believed he belonged in this room, but with the quiet directness of someone who had seen something true and felt, for reasons he could not articulate, that it needed to be said. He stopped beside her. She turned. She looked at him the way people in her position looked at people in his position, politely, briefly, already preparing to redirect him toward whoever was supposed to be handling whatever he needed. He leaned in, close enough that only she could hear, close enough that she caught the smell of clean soap and something warm underneath, and felt his breath against her ear for the 2 seconds it took to deliver 7 words. Then he stepped back. He nodded once. He walked away, back toward the service corridor, back through the door that separated his world from hers, and he did not look back. Thea Blackwell stood perfectly still in the middle of 300 people, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had absolutely no idea what her face was doing. The rest of the evening was a disaster she had to perform her way through. She gave her keynote speech at 9:15. It was a good speech. She had given it before, or versions of it, and her delivery was practiced enough to run on autopilot, while the rest of her mind replayed 7 words on a loop so relentless she lost her place twice and had to find it by reading ahead on the teleprompter. Something she had not done since her first year in the role. Her face was warm. She could feel it. The specific heat that comes from something landing in a place you did not know was exposed. And she knew, with the self-awareness of a woman who had spent a decade managing her public image, that the warmth was visible. That her cheeks had color they did not usually have, and that at least a dozen people in the front rows were going to spend the rest of the evening wondering what had happened to her before the speech. The wondering started during the reception. Her chief of staff asked if she was feeling all right. A board member said she seemed distracted, and then added, with a smile that was 90% gossip, in a good way. Adrian, who tracked her moods the way a pilot tracks weather, noticed immediately that something had shifted and could not identify the source, which irritated him in the specific way that uncertainty irritates men who believe they have earned the right to know everything about the woman they have chosen. "Are you okay?" Adrian asked, leaning in with a champagne flute and the particular softness he deployed when he wanted to seem concerned rather than curious. "I am fine," Thea said, and the fine was so transparent that Adrian tilted his head and studied her the way he studied quarterly projections, looking for the variance. She left at 10:45. Early, for her. She told her driver she wanted the long way home, which meant Constitution Avenue and the monuments and the Potomac doing its Black Mirror thing under the December sky. She sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap and her phone dark, and the 7 words sitting in her chest like a small warm stone she could not swallow and did not want to. She did not know his name. She did not know which department he worked for. She knew his voice, low and steady, the kind of voice that belongs to a person who does not waste words. She knew the smell of clean soap, and she knew the 7 words, which she was now certain she would hear every time she closed her eyes for a very long time. She went home to her Georgetown apartment, hung the black dress on the back of the bathroom door, stood in the shower for 20 minutes longer than necessary, and went to bed. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about a man she had seen for approximately 15 seconds who had looked at her face in a room full of people looking at her face and had seen something none of them ever had. How did he know? That was the question that would not let her rest. 300 people in that ballroom. Every one of them had looked at her tonight. Donors, board members, politicians, journalists, they had all seen the dress, the composure, the smile, the performance. And a man with a wrench in his back pocket had looked past every single layer of it and found the one thing she had spent 10 years hiding. And he had said it out loud, to her face, in 7 words, and walked away. She pulled the pillow over her head. She said a word that chief executives do not usually say about strangers they met for 15 seconds. And she did not sleep until 3. She found him 9 days later. Not through the hotel, which could not release staff information. Not through the event coordinator, who remembered nothing. Through the microphone stand. She had her facilities team pull the repair log for the ballroom that evening, and there it was, a single-line entry at 8:47. Mic stand base, loose bolt, repaired by N. Adiemi. Meridian Hotel Facilities. She called the hotel's facilities department at 8 the next morning, and the manager, a woman named Paulette, who had been running maintenance staffing for 15 years, and had never once received a call from a Gala client asking about a specific technician, told her that Noel Adiemi was one of the best she had. Reliable, quiet, thorough, never late, never complained, never asked for anything he had not earned. Paulette asked if there had been a problem. Thea said no, there had not been a problem, and hung up before her voice gave away the thing her face had been giving away for 9 days. What happened next was not a plan. It was closer to gravity. The Blackwell Foundation's offices occupied the top 3 floors of a building on K Street, and the building's mechanical systems were serviced by a contract with the Meridian Hotel's Facilities Division, which meant that the man who had whispered 7 words into her ear at a charity gala now showed up every Tuesday and Thursday to service the HVAC, check the elevator systems, and ensure that the lighting on floors 9 through 11 functioned at the specifications the lease required. She saw him for the first time on a Tuesday. He was in the lobby replacing a ballast in the overhead fluorescent, up on a ladder, arms above his head, and she was walking out of the elevator with a coffee she had purchased from the lobby cafe she never used, because the coffee on her floor was better. But the coffee on her floor did not require her to walk through a lobby where a man on a ladder might be working. He looked down. She looked up. The recognition was instant and absolute, the kind that does not require a name or a context or an introduction because the body has already filed the other person under important and does not need the brain's permission. He nodded once from the ladder. She nodded once from the floor. And for approximately 4 seconds the entire lobby, the security guard, the receptionist, 2 associates walking to a meeting, existed in a pocket of silence that had no business being that loud. She kept walking. He went back to the ballast. And both of them spent the rest of that Tuesday doing exactly what they had been doing for 9 days, which was thinking about the other person and pretending not to. By the second week, the geography had developed. She knew his schedule, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 9 to 4, starting in the basement and working up. She knew which stairwell he took, which corridor he used to reach the mechanical closet on her floor, which bench in the lobby he sat on during his lunch break, eating a sandwich he had made that morning while reading something on his phone with the focused attention of a man who did not waste his breaks. He knew her schedule too, though he would not have admitted it. He knew she arrived at 8:30, took the stairs when she was stressed, and stood at the window in the 9th floor conference room for exactly 2 minutes every afternoon at 3. Looking out at the city the way people look at things they love, but are not sure love them back. They spoke for the first time on a Thursday, 11 days after the gala, in the mechanical closet on the 10th floor, which was a sentence Thea Blackwell never imagined would appear in the story of her life. She had come to check on a thermostat complaint that did not exist, carrying a coffee she did not need, wearing an expression she had not rehearsed. He was kneeling beside an air handler, and he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, and something crossed his face that was not surprise exactly, but more like the resignation of a man who had known this conversation was coming and had not decided yet what to do with it. "I have been looking for you," she said, which was more honest than she had intended. He stood slowly. "I know," he said. "How do you know?" "Because I have been trying not to be found." She looked at him. She felt the 7 words sitting between them like an object on the floor that both of them could see and neither of them was picking up. She did not ask him to repeat them. She was not ready. Not yet. Instead, she asked, "Why did you say it?" Noel looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Because it was true, and because I thought you deserved to hear it from someone who had no reason to lie." After that, the pretending stopped. They did not date. That is not the right word for what grew between a chief executive on the 9th floor and a facilities engineer who entered through the service door. What they did was exist in each other's awareness with an honesty that neither of them had experienced in a long time. They talked in corridors when the building was quiet, in stairwells between floors, in the mechanical closet that had somehow become the most private room in a building full of glass offices. He told her about Amara, the copper threads she still found sometimes, caught in a drawer joint or wound around a curtain rod, and how each one felt like a small message left behind by someone who had known she would be missed and had planted evidence of herself in every room. He told her about Sadeh, who had inherited her mother's eye and her father's quiet, and who evaluated every new person in her life the way a jeweler evaluates a stone, thoroughly and without sentiment. She told him about the years since her last relationship, about the particular loneliness of running an organization where every person wanted something from her and nobody wanted her. About the nights she drove past the monuments on the way home and wondered whether there was a version of success that did not require this much silence. Sade, as always, saw through him within days. "Dad, you are humming again," she said one evening at dinner. "I hum sometimes. You hum when something good happened. You whistle when you are working. This is the humming." He looked at her across the kitchen table, and she looked back at him with the specific expression of a 7-year-old who had decided she knew exactly what was happening and was simply waiting for the adult to catch up. "Is it the Gala lady?" she said. He paused. "How do you know about the Gala lady?" "Because you told Miss Tanya you were nervous, and Miss Tanya tells me everything." Adrian noticed too, though his methods of observation were considerably less charming. He had spent 8 months watching Thea deflect every personal advance with the practiced ease of a woman who had turned rejection into an art form, and he had never once seen her distracted. Now she was distracted. Not in meetings, not in presentations, but in the spaces between them, the corridors, the elevator, the 2 minutes at the window at 3 o'clock. She was somewhere else, and somewhere else was a place Adrian could not reach, and the inability to reach it was becoming a problem he intended to solve. He filed the request on a Thursday. A facilities services review, citing response time efficiency. The recommendation, buried in language that sounded operational and felt personal, was to rotate the Meridian Hotel's assigned technician on a quarterly basis to ensure fresh perspectives on building management, a rotation that would move Noel out of the K Street building and replace him with someone who had never whispered 7 words to anyone at a gala. Thea found the request on her desk on Friday morning. She read it twice. Then she walked into Adrian's office without knocking and closed the door behind her. "I am going to ask you one question," she said, "and I would like you to answer it honestly." Adrian leaned back. "Of course. Is this about the building or about me?" Adrian's composure held for about 3 seconds. "It is about operational standards," he said. "Then you will not mind if I review it with the full board," she said. "Since it is purely operational." Adrian said nothing. The request was withdrawn by Monday. He transferred to the Foundation's New York office within the month, taking with him a title and a salary, and leaving behind the one thing he had wanted most and never had a chance of getting. The night everything changed was a Tuesday in February, 6 weeks after the gala. Sade had a school concert at 7, and Noel had asked Miss Tanya to take her because his shift at the K Street building ran until 8. But at 6:15, standing in the mechanical closet on the 10th floor replacing a relay, he heard footsteps in the corridor that he recognized the way you recognize a song after the first 2 notes. Thea appeared in the doorway. She was not in her work clothes. She was in a coat and boots, dressed for outside, holding 2 cups of coffee from the lobby cafe. "Your daughter has a concert tonight," she said. He looked at her. "How do you know that? You mentioned it last Thursday." "In the stairwell." He had mentioned it once, in passing, between the 8th and 9th floors. She had remembered. "I brought you coffee," she said, "and I called your manager. Your shift ends now." He stared at her. She held out the coffee with the steady hand of a woman who had made a decision and was not interested in negotiating it. He took the cup. Their fingers touched on the handoff, and neither of them pretended it was an accident. He made the concert. Sade was in the 3rd row of the choir, singing with the focused intensity of a child who believed every note mattered. He sat in the back of the auditorium with coffee he had not bought, and a feeling in his chest he had not felt in 3 years, and when Sade found him afterward and asked why he was smiling like that, he said he was proud of her. Which was true, and also not the whole truth. The following Friday, Sade met Thea. Not at the office, not at the building, but at the farmer's market on Capitol Hill, because Sade had informed her father that any woman important enough to make him hum needed to be evaluated in a neutral territory. And the farmer's market was where Sade conducted all her most important business. Thea arrived in jeans and a coat, looking like a version of herself that 300 Gala guests would not have recognized. Sade studied her for exactly 8 seconds, the way she studied everything, and then said, "You have good earrings." "My mom used to have earrings like that." Thea crouched down so they were the same height. "Thank you," she said. "I like your braids." "My dad did them," Sade said. "He is getting better." Something passed between them in that moment that had nothing to do with earrings, and Noel, standing 6 feet away with a bag of apples he had forgotten he was holding, understood that the door he had been afraid to open had just been opened by a 7-year-old, who had decided, with the absolute certainty of childhood, that this person was worth knowing. Weeks later, on a cold Saturday in March, they were walking along the Tidal Bassin, with Sade running ahead toward the water. The cherry blossoms were not out yet. The trees stood bare and patient, holding their weight for the moment the weather would allow them to let go. Thea was wearing his jacket because the wind off the Potomac had teeth. Not the dress jacket from the Gala, his everyday jacket. The canvas one with the worn cuffs, the one that smelled like clean soap and the mechanical closet on the 10th floor. She had not asked for it. He had draped it over her shoulders without a word, the way he did things, and she had put her arms through the sleeves and pulled the collar up and breathed him in without trying to hide it. They walked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the kind that belongs to two people who have stopped needing to fill every space with words because the spaces have become comfortable on their own. Then she stopped walking. "Tell me again," she said. He looked at her. "What you said that night, at the Gala." She turned to face him. "I have heard it every day since. In my head. In meetings, in the shower. Before I fall asleep. I hear it every single time I look in a mirror. But I need to hear you say it, out loud, to my face. So I know it was real." Noel looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the bare cherry trees. He looked at Sade, who was crouching by the water examining something with the focused attention she brought to all important discoveries. He looked at the woman in front of him, wearing his jacket, asking him to say the truest thing he had ever said to a stranger. Again, this time, not to a stranger. He stepped forward. He leaned in, the way he had that night, close enough that only she could hear, close enough that she felt his breath against her ear the way she had 6 weeks ago in a room full of 300 people. And he said the 7 words. "You have the saddest eyes of anyone smiling in this room." Only this time there was no room. There was no gala. There was no performance. There was just a man and a woman standing beside the water in the early spring cold, and the sentence landed differently now. Not as an observation, but as a declaration. Because what he was really saying, what he had been saying since the night he saw her across a ballroom and could not stop himself from walking toward her, was "I see you. The real one. And I am not looking away." Thea Blackwell, who had spent a decade in rooms where 300 people looked at her and saw power, stood on the edge of the tidal basin and felt, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely, completely, terrifyingly seen. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried, but her chin trembled, and she pressed her forehead against his shoulder and stayed there, breathing. And he put his arms around her without ceremony, the way he did everything, and they stood like that, while the wind came off the water and Sade looked up from her discovery at the shore and watched them for a moment, and then went back to what she was doing. Because children understand, better than anyone, when two people have finally found the thing they were both looking for. Months later, Friday evenings belonged to the three of them. Not at the gala. Not at the office. At the row house in Southeast, where the kitchen table wobbled and the stove needed convincing, and Sade had claimed the corner by the window for her weaving loom, a small wooden frame Noelle had built her because she had decided, sometime in the last year, that she wanted to learn the thing her mother had done, and the copper thread she used was the same copper thread that still turned up in drawer joints and around curtain rods. Because some things do not end when a person leaves. They just find new hands. Thea came most Fridays still wearing her work clothes, and she would change into something of Noelle's, a sweatshirt or an old flannel, because she had discovered that the fastest way to stop being a chief executive was to stop dressing like one. She learned to braid Sade's hair, badly at first, then better, with Sade narrating corrections in real time the way air traffic controllers narrate landings, calmly and with great specificity. She learned to make the oatmeal the way Sade liked it, with exactly too much brown sugar. And she learned, slowly and without anyone teaching her, how to sit in a room full of imperfect things and feel perfectly at home. One Friday evening, after Sade had fallen asleep on the couch, with her weaving still in her hands, Thea stood in the kitchen doorway in Noelle's flannel shirt and looked at him washing dishes. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always. That night at the gala, when you saw me. Why did you walk over? You could have kept going. You could have gone back to the service corridor and finished your shift and never said a word." "Why?" Noel dried his hands. He leaned against the counter and thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything, giving the question the same precise attention he gave a relay or a circuit or a 7-year-old's braid. "Because," he said, "I have spent 3 years walking into rooms where nobody sees me. And I looked across that ballroom and saw a woman surrounded by 300 people and realized nobody was seeing her either." He paused, and I thought, that is too many sad eyes for one room. Thea looked at him. She crossed the kitchen. She straightened the collar of his shirt the way she had seen him straighten a bolt, with care and no performance, and she left her hand there, on the collar, on his neck. And they stood like that, close enough to count heartbeats, in a kitchen that smelled like brown sugar and dish soap, while a 7-year-old dreamed on the couch behind them with copper thread wound around her fingers. In the wallet on the counter, a single copper thread lay folded beside a photograph of a woman who had left evidence of herself in every room she had ever entered. On the shelf by the kitchen window sat a small wooden frame with a half-finished weaving in copper and blue, and beside it, a card in Sade's careful handwriting. "For Mom. So she can see from wherever she is. So let me ask you something tonight. Has anyone ever said something so short and so true that it changed the way you understood yourself? And you have been hearing it ever since. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. And if this story stayed with you, you know what to do. New stories every week.